All right, y'all, welcome back. This is the last video lecture in our three-part metabolism unit, so let's finish strong. You can see we're starting here where we left off last time with an overview of cell respiration. Remember, regardless of pathway, metabolic pathway, you also always start with glycolysis. That's where you take glucose and you actually break it down, hence glyco, short for glycogen, another name for glucose. Thereabouts. And then lysis, meaning to unbind or loosen. So you're essentially breaking apart those bonds that hold glucose together. You do that, it releases 2 ATP, but most importantly, pyruvate molecules, which are then going to go, depending on the availability of oxygen, to either aerobic or anaerobic respiration pathways. With oxygen, you first go through the Krebs cycle, which does generate 2 ATP, but most importantly, it generates tons of hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions find their way to the electron transport chain, where a process known as oxidative phosphorylation takes place that can generate up to 34 ATP total. If there is no oxygen, you go through one of our fermentation pathways, and the two we discussed are alcohol or lactic acid fermentation. Either way, you produce 2 more ATP. So grand total, all right, if you're looking for your net ATP with oxygen, there's 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs, up to 34 from the ETC. That gives you a grand total of 38. Without oxygen, there's 2 from glycolysis, 2 from fermentation, grand total of 4. And that's why we say that aerobic respiration is far more efficient, because you can make 32 to 34 more ATP versus what you're doing anaerobically. So the important part here is no matter what, you start with glucose. So where does that glucose come from? And that's where photosynthesis takes place. So what you should get out of this lecture, besides the brief review we just did, were what are the reactants and products of photosynthesis? Remember, different sides of the equation. Reactants are needed to react. Products are what's produced. What happens during the various metabolic pathways? Just like with what we just discussed with cell respiration, there's more than one pathway or cycle for these things to go through. And what relationship exists between cell respiration and photosynthesis? How are they cyclical in nature? So, photosynthesis, like always, let's break that word apart. Photo means light, and synthesis is to make. So essentially, you're making something with light. All right, so definition here. Plants use sunlight to make glucose, carbohydrates, from water and carbon dioxide. Now, those two should sound familiar. In fact, they're the products of cell respiration. When you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide and water from cell respiration. Well, those products are actually the reactants for photosynthesis. You can see right here, carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, carbon dioxide, water, and they yield after photosynthesis glucose and oxygen. Here's glucose, here's oxygen. And again, these should look familiar. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cell respiration. We take in glucose through the food we eat, and we breathe in oxygen from the air we breathe. So again, like we just talked about on the last slide, what is that relationship? They're interdependent. Not necessarily codependent, but interdependent on one another. The products of one are the reactants for the other. The products of that one are the reactants for the other process. So in that way, it goes in a cycle. Sure enough, you can see energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, water from the roots, and it yields oxygen. And you can't see in this diagram glucose is because the plant holds on to glucose. It's not necessarily a byproduct like oxygen gas. It stores it for use at the mitochondrial centers of the plant cell. So let's talk about the chloroplast. Like we learned about when we discussed endosymbiosis a few weeks back, chloroplast is similar to a mitochondria in a way that it has its own DNA, so its own lineage, as it were. It reproduces on its own as well. So if you look at a plant, it's got leaves, right? Within that leaf, there's different layers. Just like an animal has different cells, you've got bone cells, skin cells, muscle cells, things like that. Immune cells, whatever. All right, plants are the same way. You've got this waxy outer layer, followed by what's known as like a palisade layer. The middle is mesophyll, meso meaning middle. All right, so the mesophyll is right here in the middle. You can see here's a gas exchange taking place in something known as a stroma, or stomata. Sorry, stroma is in a second. All right, within that mesophyll, you can zoom in and see a plant cell. This is an actual micrograph, a photograph from a microscope where you can see the cell. Here's the cell wall around it. Here's large area in the middle, full of tiny little chloroplasts. So here's a diagram of a chloroplast, and you see there's actually 2 main areas. They're underlined. There's the thylakoids, which are these stacks. It looks like stacks of pancakes or stacks of pennies, something like that. And the stroma is that space between. And here's just another black and white version of this chloroplast by itself. And you can see the grana, that's a fancy name for a stack of thylakoids, and then the stroma is that space between. Well, the stroma and the thylakoids are where these metabolic pathways actually take place. So what metabolic pathways are there? First, as we all know, photosynthesis requires light. So the reactions where light takes place are known as the light reactions. I know, stretch, right? This occurs in the thylakoids. That's these little stacks. Here's a zoom in of the thylakoid membrane. It actually uses energy from the sun. It uses light energy to split water apart. Remember, it takes in H2O, water, as a reactant, and what's it going to do with it? It needs to split that hydrogen and oxygen apart. What do you think it does with the oxygen? It releases it as a byproduct, which is good for us, right? Good for animals. It sends the hydrogen to the next cycle, which is the Calvin cycle. Again, like I always say, I really encourage you guys to pursue science, pursue innovation, invent something or discover something, and name it after yourself. Think about that. That's what old Calvin did. That's what Krebs did in our last video, right? Remember Golgi from a few months back? Anyways, it also generates ATP to run that Calvin cycle. Sometimes you think, oh, it takes money to make money. Same thing here. You have to make a couple of ATP to run our next metabolic pathway, the Calvin cycle. So again, brief review. These reactions occur in the thylakoids. They use energy from the sun to split H2O. It sends that hydrogen to the Calvin cycle along with a couple ATP to the Calvin cycle. And then it actually releases that oxygen as a byproduct, which is good for us. And you see that reaction right here. Here's energy from the sun. Here's water, H2O. It splits that water. See how it's releasing this oxygen here as a byproduct? And then these hydrogens are going this way. As they do, to make their way to the Calvin cycle, it's generating a couple of ATP with another ATP synthase enzyme. Awesome, right? It's like it all keeps coming back up. All right, so the Calvin cycle then, all right, these are light independent. That means you don't have to have sunlight to occur. The light reactions only occur during the daytime or whenever plants are exposed to artificial light. They need light in order to occur. The Calvin cycle, on the other hand, are light independent, meaning they occur overnight. So 24 hours a day, a plant's going through the Calvin cycle, whereas only times where it's exposed to sunlight or wavelengths of any kind is where it goes through light reactions. This occurs instead of the thylakoid stacks, this occurs in the stroma. This runs on ATP that was donated from the light reaction. So you can see 6 ATP come in here. Well, after you break that bond, right, you hydrolyze that bond between the second and third phosphate groups. Now you have 6 ADP. Same thing happens over here, 3 ATP, just to run little checkpoints here, get energy to make it go. It attaches that hydrogen that came from the light reactions from water. It attaches that to carbon dioxide. So this is where that CO2 that plants bring in through the air, through the leaves, this is where that occurs. So it takes that hydrogen, sticks it to a carbon dioxide. If you remember way back to our biochem unit, what is a carbohydrate? It's a carbon and water. Carbohydrate, C, H, and O. So sure enough, you take H and you get the oxygens here from carbon dioxide. You've got the carbons there in the middle, and all together it releases that glucose. You can see it spitting off sugar down here below. It releases that glucose to the plant cell for storage. Well, what's it going to do with glucose? Very good. We just talked about it in our last video. All right, plants also have mitochondria in order to drive, their energy needs. The big difference is, and again, forgive the pun, you guys know I hate puns, but these plants are literally rooted in place. They can't go down to Rally's and get some cheese fries a couple blocks up from St. Charles High. They have to actually make their own food. That's why plants have this intermediate photosynthesis step, and that's why their cells have both mitochondria and chloroplasts. Whereas animals like us, or giraffes, or lions, or whatever you're thinking of, they just have mitochondria. So, once again, here's a carbohydrate. This carbon and the oxygen actually come from carbon dioxide. The hydrate, the H, sorry, in the middle, the H, the hydrogen, comes from water. And then the water, the H2O, releases the O as a byproduct. So let's look at it overall. Again, you've got light comes in from the light reactions. It spits out oxygen as a byproduct here. These are occurring in the thylakoids. Notice the little stacks here. One stack of a thylakoid is called a grana. Right, so water comes in, it's split, it sends the hydrogen from that water after it releases oxygen here. It sends that hydrogen to the Calvin cycle in the form of NADPH. We talked about that before with electron carriers, things like that. It also sends a couple ATP in order to drive these light-independent reactions. So what it does is it takes this hydrogen from the water, attaches it to this carbon dioxide from the air, and then carbon dioxide, water, the H from the water, that's HCO, so it releases it as a sugar, a carbohydrate. And this occurs in the stroma, which is that space that just fills in the areas between these thylakoid stacks. All this occurs within the chloroplast. And you see after it uses ATP, it spits back out ADP and phosphate for it to be phosphorylated again or fixed back to one another at that ATP synthase enzyme, which is in that thylakoid membrane. So here's that interdependence component one last time. You got photosynthesis driven by sunlight. See the stacks of thylakoids in here? In here you've got your light reactions and the Calvin cycle. It releases oxygen as a byproduct, spits out glucose to the plant to use for its energy needs. Well, mitochondria take that glucose and through a process known as cell respiration, they release ATP. Obviously, there's some heat involved. We talked about burning hydrocarbons before in our ATP video, the first part of this unit. So it releases ATP, and then as products, it's carbon dioxide and water. Well, sure enough, that's what plants need. So you can see how the products of this cell respiration reaction are actually the reactants for photosynthesis. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants for cell respiration. So that's where that interdependence or that cyclical cycle nature comes from. So again, 3 parts of this unit. There was ATP, cell respiration, and photosynthesis. Hopefully you could see by now how all 3 of these processes have different metabolic pathways within and how they're all related, that interrelatedness between plants and animals, plant cells and animal cells, mitochondria and chloroplast keeps coming up over and over and over again. And if you get any one thing from this unit as a whole, it should be that interdependent nature. Great job.